الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Welcome to Understanding Islam, Series 2. This week we're going to look at the Sufi ways in ascent to God. Often in Islam, the conversation goes around the threefold path of growing into the ways of Islam. It is based around an episode recounted in the Quran in which the desert Arabs came to the Prophet and said, "O Messenger of God, we believe." And he responded, "Don't say that you believe, say that you have given your consent, you have submitted to God, because belief has not yet entered into your heart." So this leads us into a discussion of the threefold path in the way of God. The first step on that path is Islam, that is, submitting one's life and one's actions following the path that God has laid out. The second step is Iman. Iman is belief, and that is bringing your thoughts and your belief and purifying your faith so that you are correctly believing according to the guidance of God. But then the third part of that step is to go to Ihsan. And Ihsan means to live constantly in the presence of God, knowing that even if you can't see God, God can see you. Or another way of talking about Ihsan is to say, we are living the good and the beautiful. God loves beauty. God is beautiful. To live a godly way of life is to live all things that are good and beautiful. And this is Ihsan. The Sufi journey is a journey into the heart of the human being. So it is, as it were, a twofold movement. On the one hand, it is an inward journey into the heart of the believer. But at the same time, the heart is ascending into love of God. So in the depth of the human being, the very self of the human being, one finds there the breath, the spark of the divine light within every human being. This is the pathway then to ascend into a divine embrace. So this twofold journey is at the heart of the Sufi ways. Now, the heart is the center of the human being. It is our center of thought, of will, but also our center of knowledge. Knowledge which is not just intellectual, but knowledge which is also intuitive. So it is the knowledge of things in a whole way, and not just as a series of statements. Now, the heart of the human being is the seat of love and of wisdom, and therefore it is that within the human being which is most able to respond to the divine love and in turn to love God. But our problems are that our hearts are cluttered, our hearts have confusion, our hearts are somehow tangled. They need to be untangled, they need to be purified, they need to be polished. And so in this polishing process, we come more and more to be able to reflect the divine love and to enter into this two-way exchange of love. There is a crucial verse of the Quran in which God tells us, if you love me, if you love God, follow Muhammad and God will love you. So the following of Muhammad becomes the pathway into the love of God. We can say that the spiritual gesture of Islam is the imitation of Muhammad in every way, imitating him in his obedience to the commands of God. Muhammad always said that he was the servant of God, that he too was subject to the guidance of God. He wasn't above it, but rather, like the rest of humankind, he would observe the commands and steer clear of those things that God forbids. So the first step then in the imitation of Muhammad is through submitting our will to the will of God and learning obedience and following in this path. Now there is a hadith Qudsi. This is a saying of God which is given to Muhammad to convey to us, in which God says that those who love God should obey God in all the things that God has commanded and observe all the prohibitions, and then my servant will do additional voluntary acts of service, of love, and will keep on doing so until eventually I, God, becomes the hand with which he acts, the eye with which he sees, the tongue with which he speaks, and so on. So that actually this process of growing into God comes from the first step of obedience to the commands and prohibitions to the next step of going beyond what is required, going beyond in acts of love and service to God and to humankind. One of the things about Prophet Muhammad is that he is spoken of as al-Insan al-Kamil, the perfect human being, the essence of what it is to be human. And in his humanity, he most perfectly manifests the qualities of God. So the Prophet is in a sense then the living Quran. He most perfectly manifests the divine attributes of God. Now, if we want to understand this manifestation on the part of the Prophet, perhaps we can take the example of the sun and the moon. See, we often say things like, oh, the moon is shining brightly tonight. But we actually know that the moon has no light in itself at all. And when we see the moon shining brightly, it is the sun which is shining, which is reflecting upon the moon, and then we see that light. If you were to take the sun out of the question, then the moon would be pure darkness. And so the Prophet is rather like the moon in this model. The Prophet is not himself divine. He is not the source of divine light. That is God. That is like the sun. But God is shedding that light upon the Prophet, and the Prophet manifests it. As it were, he is a mirror in which we can see the qualities of God which are radiating upon him. Now, all the qualities of God, all the beautiful names of God, the attributes of God, they are being shed upon the Prophet. The Prophet is like a perfectly polished spherical mirror. And as the light strikes it, it is reflected from the Prophet himself. And so in looking at the Prophet, we see the qualities of God. Now then, when we talk about the imitation of Muhammad, what we're talking about is polishing the mirror of the heart of the individual human being so that it may be removed from all those tangles and clouds that would distort the attributes of God which are shed upon it. So the Sufi practices are there in order to polish the heart of the individual, to make it a more perfect receptor of the divine light and qualities, and a most perfect reflector of those qualities, so that we can actually see, as it were, the light and qualities of God radiating from the human being who is in this embrace of love with God. Not because of what they are in themselves, but because of the way in which their heart reflects that which God sheds upon them. One of the qualities of Prophet Muhammad was his simplicity of life. We're told, for example, that he would never stand on ceremony. When he walked into the gathering, he would sit anywhere that there was a spare place. We're told that he would repair his own clothes, he would repair his own sandals, that he was always someone who wanted to be sitting with other people. He was always someone who would give away whatever was given to him. So we're told that he always went to bed with empty pockets. Whatever was given to him during the day was given away by the time that he went to bed at night. Now, in this simplicity of life, he also becomes a model for the Sufi. Indeed, the word Sufi reflects this, because there was a bench attached to the place, the mosque of the Prophet, the place where he used to receive people, and there was an area there with a little roof over it, and there were a couple of benches there where poor people would gather for food. And also some people would gather there who wanted to be close to the Prophet, to seek his company, to go on this spiritual journey under his guidance. So they were often called the people of the bench. And they would obviously be poor people, and they would therefore dress in poor clothes, and the word suf means wool. So they would wear simple woolen clothing. Now, some of these people of the bench would actually embrace a voluntary poverty. They were involved in renunciation, we can say. They're called fakir, those who choose to live a life of great simplicity and poverty so that they are not tied down by the affairs of this world. Now, Prophet Muhammad not only taught them the spiritual practices on the bench, but he also taught them things that one could only learn by this close, loving relationship with God. Remember that the Prophet himself has received knowledge of things beyond the sight of human beings in his night journey and ascent into heaven. And so he gives them hidden knowledge which is not available to other people. And he teaches them practices which enable them to go on this journey of exploration, this journey of penetrating into the embrace of God themselves. So we can say that their journey is a kind of imitation of his great night journey, his mirage, when he ascended to heaven into the divine presence. One of the things that the Quran commands is that one should remember God often. One should remember God when one's standing, when one's sitting, when one's lying. One should remember God as one goes about one's business. So that the practice that the prophet was teaching people was the practice of developing the constant remembrance of God. And this we would call through tzikr. Tzikr is the prayer of the remembrance of God. It is the prayer of the heart. And by teaching people this methodology and by people practicing it, they can then grow and develop into the constant remembrance of God so that their whole being is constantly living in that divine embrace. The whole process is one of purification. It is one of the removal of sin, the removal of rebellion, the removal of ego, so that one is constantly obeying God, in harmony with God, acknowledging God as the source of love, of obedience, the awesome presence in one's life. And in this process, one is then entering into the purification that makes one able to radiate that love in the world to other people. The knowledge and the practices that Muhammad taught to his companions on the bench was not just for them alone. They became the teachers of the next generation. And so we get an understanding of a chain of teachers, a silsila. This chain of teachers links Sufis down through the centuries back to that community who were sitting with the Prophet and learning from him directly. Now, these different chains eventually form into communities who are often called tariqas. They have different ways and methods of practicing the remembrance of God and training the heart. But the silsila is very important here, because within a tariqa, one learns from the one who taught me. And so I can trace my chain back all the way to that group on the bench through Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of Muhammad, or one group traces itself back through Abu Bakr. This process of being trained is at the heart of the Sufi system. The Sufi teacher is called a sheikh, or if she's a woman, a sheikha. So the sheikh is there to train those who would follow his or her guidance. You cannot guide me if you have not been there before. So it is a process of sharing experience and spiritual wisdom that one has learned from one's own sheikh in turn. This forms then the Sufi tariqa. Now, Sufi tariqas are generally divided into two groups. One group goes by the name of sukr. This means intoxicated, perhaps enraptured. Those who are just overwhelmed by the love, by the proximity, by the intimacy of God. And within these groups of tariqas, often they have to express their teaching through poetry, because only poetry can be evocative for this depth of spiritual intensity and intoxication. We find here also the use of music and of movement. It could be swaying, it could be standing, it could be jumping, it could be whirling on the spot, like the whirling of the dervishes. And all these forms of zikr, of remembrance of God, are training the heart and encouraging the rapture of living in this loving embrace. The second group of Sufi tariqas are spoken of as being the people of sahu. This is sobriety. These are people who are overwhelmed by the awe and majesty of God. They feel themselves to be very much the servants of God, in awe and in prostration in the divine presence. Now, they would tend to express themselves in prose, in carefully worked out and measured writings, and they emphasize the distance between the human being and God and the awesomeness of that relationship. Over the centuries, these different tariqas have worked out a systematic training process in which the sheikh takes one on a journey. Crucially important here is that everyone who would go on the Sufi path must have a guide, must have a sheikh. There is a saying amongst the Sufis that says, anyone who would go on the Sufi way without a sheikh, Shaitan himself comes to lead that person astray, to be his sheikh. So it's very important that one has a teacher. It's also very important, especially in our own modern age, there are some people who think that they can follow the Sufi practices without the discipline of Islam, without the discipline of following the Sharia and following the outer practices of being a Muslim. This is not acceptable within the Sufi tariqas. One must first of all accept obedience and submission in the outer forms before one can enter into the inner spiritual ascent. So the sheikh will take the individual on a progression, a series of stations that one goes from one to the next through a series of spiritual exercises, a series of prayers that are to be repeated, of fasts that are to be done, of examination of one's life, so that one goes from one station to the next and makes progress in this spiritual ascent. The number of stations, the sequence of them, varies from one tariqa to another. But there comes a stage at which one has passed through these different stations and one has been spiritually purified or polished sufficiently for God to actually bestow a state upon the person, so that in this phase of one's growth, one actually directly experiences the awesome love of God, which is reaching out to the person in that divine embrace. That marks the end of Series 2 of Understanding Islam. Look out shortly for Series 3.